Welcome to the Regeneration International podcast.
I've sort of inadvertently known Helena for a very long time. It's actually only recently we've met face to face. But I've known about her since the 1980s from Ladakh when I was up there. And she's actually spent a long time in Ladakh in the Himalayas working with the Ladakhis, and she set up a place that I used to go to every day when I was in Ladakh, and that was the Ladakh Environmental Centre. And one of the things I always remember is having wonderful food from a solar cooker. And it was actually one of the best libraries I'd ever been to, and it's where I learned about climate change. Helena is actually a lot more than just Ladakh. She's actually won the Alternative Nobel Prize, the Arthur Morgan Award, the Goi Peace Prize, and she's also the author of Ancient Futures and Local is Our Future. And she's co-authored Bringing Food Economies Home and the Ground Up, and the award-winning documentary, The Economics of Happiness. And Helena is the founder and director of Local Futures and the International Alliance of Localisation. And she's a founding member of the International Commission on the Future of Food and Agriculture. So, Helena, what I'd like to do now is give the floor to you and take it away, please.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm very glad to be coming after you. And so glad that you were stressing the local. That's what we need to do these days. So I'm very happy to be able to do this. And so in order to understand why local is so important, we have realized that people need to understand a little bit about globalization and even about the origins of the modern economy. And to understand that really the system that we're now struggling to change, and we really do need to change the dominant economic system, actually started because global traders got too much power. And so we've had really from the beginnings of the modern economy a way in which the local has been marginalized. And I want to show you a little film that we made about that to explain how it is that we need to really have our eye on the bigger picture in order to embrace localization as a systemic path. And we would argue that right now there's definitely room for global trade and so on in the long run, but we need an immediate shift away from policies that are supporting the big and the global at the expense of the small and the local. I hope this little film that we're going to show make that clear. It's called Local.
Every day on the news, we see a world hurtling from one crisis to the next.
Most of us are running faster than ever just to keep food on the table and a roof over our head.
But worst of all, we're told it's our fault. It's human nature.
It can certainly look that way, but dig a little deeper and something else emerges.
The ever-expanding global economy.
A healthy economy is one in which humans meet their needs without destroying nature or without harming others. Our current system has brought benefits to many people, but we are now seeing the true cost of those benefits. The cogs of the modern economy were set in motion in the late 1400s, when the elites in Europe began destroying close-knit, self-reliant communities through a process called the enclosures. They burnt crops and destroyed villages.
In the same period, they also began invading and decimating local economies around the world, making slaves of their populations.
These slaves were then used to grow crops like cotton and sugar for export.
And so began a historical shift, a move away from local communities providing for their own needs towards large-scale production for a global market.
The end result was that global traders got richer and richer at the expense of society as a whole.
And favouring global traders over community is still a central cog in the economic machine today.
Our governments have been using our tax money to subsidize and deregulate these global corporations.
Big tech, big ag, big media, big oil, big banks, big pharma.
While at the same time squeezing local and national businesses through heavy taxation and over-regulation.
Two very different sets of rules, one for the local, another for the global.
Today, these corporations and banks have become a sort of global invisible empire, to the point where they regularly determine the policies of our governments.
Like when the German government was sued by a fossil fuel company for not letting it build a power plant that would pollute a pristine river.
Trade has always been a part of our lives, but it has now acquired an almost religious status, resulting in meat, vegetables, manufactured goods, currencies, even bottled water, moving around the globe in every direction.
In 2019, the US imported 1.4 million tons of beef and veal, and in the same year exported almost exactly the same amount.
While English-grown apples have travelled all the way to South Africa to be washed and waxed, then flown back again to be sold.
Routinely exploiting human labour and burning vast amounts of fossil fuels.
As a result, we are currently using twice as many resources as the Earth can replenish in a year. And at a target rate of 3% growth a year, the global economy will be double its size in 2043 and 7 times bigger in 2100.
The taxes we pay from our hard work are not supporting our local communities or the things we value, like health, the environment, or democracy. Instead, they're propping up this ever-expanding economic machine.
A machine that made the world's billionaires $3.9 trillion during the first year of COVID.
A machine that is driving climate change and mass extinction.
A machine that still today requires 45 million slaves.
We are blindly crowdfunding our own social and environmental demise.
So what can we do?
Lots. We can still turn things around if we focus on reversing the central cogs of the machine, away from the global and towards the local. When we realize that the machine is working against almost everyone's interest, then there's genuine hope of building up enough people power to turn the cogs around.
Right now, we are allowing the rules of this system to be written by a tiny minority.
And why is this happening? Largely because of ignorance. We know that big corporations have too much power, but we hear almost nothing about how the economic system works to give them that power.
And it is ignorance. The vast majority of us, even those who work within corporations, don't want to see nature destroyed or a wider gap between rich and poor.
That's why raising awareness needs to be our first action.
Big picture activism.
That means showing how the global system is damaging both people and planet, and how going local can help to turn things around.
It's vital that we share this knowledge so we can unite social and environmental activists.
And bring about a mass movement to make a united demand of our governments.
Re-regulate the big and global.
Rebuild
The small and local. This doesn't mean eliminating global trade, but rather encouraging greater self-reliance.
Which is what COVID has taught us. As we enter a future of more pandemics and more climate shocks, we're going to need local control over our basic needs, especially food and energy.
Yes, and that means shifting taxes, regulations and subsidies that currently favor global trade to support local, regional and national economies instead.
To be really clear, this isn't nationalism.
It's about ensuring that the democratic process shapes business, rather than big business shaping our societies, supporting small scale on a large scale.
This means supporting more diversified small farms selling at local markets and shops.
It means supporting community energy and local finance initiatives.
More models of usership rather than ownership.
Or citizen juries and local democracy models.
Because it's on the foundations of local economies that the deep bonds of community can be built.
Going local offers us a genuine human connection.
And that's why a localization movement is already happening around the world. It's time to wake up, listen, learn, and act.
It's time to demand these changes from our politicians and to elect brave leaders who support these changes.
It's time to embrace Indigenous wisdom and remember that our real economy is the living world.
It's time to stop fighting each other and start fighting for a better system.
Just imagine how different our world would look if we allowed the small, the diverse, the authentic to flourish.
There's nothing inevitable or natural about our current system.
It's man-made.
And if enough of us come together, we can change it. I'll tell people about that film. It's called Local, A Story of Hope. And we made it with Damon Gameau, who's a very well-known documentary filmmaker in Australia and a close friend. He made a film called That Sugar Film. And he also made 2040, which I hope you've heard of. And he helped us put together this 8-minute attempt at showing why it's so important that we understand how the global economy has been misshaping our world for a very long time. And this misshaping has escalated in the last 30, 35 years. And I, along with people like Vandana Shiva, who's part of this program, I started a forum on globalization where we were studying the impact of trade treaties on different countries around the world. And it became very obvious that the biggest losers were small farmers, because these trade treaties were allowing giant agribusinesses to have complete freedom to move as they liked, to have no restrictions. And for quite a while now, they are actually pressuring our governments, forcing our governments to sign in black and white that the government will not do anything to decrease their profit-making potential. So we have now a global casino economy that has these heavy subsidies and is being deregulated, while at the national and local level, everyone is being subjected to heavy taxation and heavy regulation. And the heavy regulation when it comes to small-scale farming and small-scale restaurants, food producers, shops even, the regulation is often brought in to destroy small competitors. So we're not talking here about bad people and good people, but we are talking about a blindness to the way that the global economy has got out of control. And there is a very clear way to control it. As long as people are aware that this is the main reason behind climate change, behind poverty, the extinction of biodiversity, and so on. So that's the general framing. And we have for a very long time in my organization been promoting local food economies. And we're finding that all around the world, when people start shortening the distances, that you see almost immediately multiple benefits. What our problem is in our organization is that it's almost impossible to get this message out. We have a very common sense, clear message, which I am convinced most people would agree with, but it's almost impossible to get it out because we are threatening the large corporate bodies that now dominate the social media as well as the mainstream media. And unfortunately, even the environmental movements, the food movements, most of us have actually been directed to look at things in too local a way. Paradoxically, we're promoting localization, but we're warning about a perspective that is too narrowly local, too many people are caught up in seeing the problems in their own country at best, and usually, in their own region. But very often, to the extent that they look at the bigger picture, they'll be looking at their government. So we hear all the time, well, in Australia, we've got this really bad way of doing this and that. And we hear the same thing in Kenya, we hear the same thing in Bhutan, we hear the same thing in Sweden, where I come from. Almost no one has been briefed with looking at the global picture. Those who have been looking globally have usually been the purveyors of rampant consumerism and an imposition of a consumer monoculture that is disastrous for most of the human race. It fundamentally creates the illusion that farmers are backward and primitive. So it has a huge impact on the global south, on those farmers that Andre was talking about, who are now producing 80% of the food. Those farmers are day by day being pressured psychologically with a type of enormous psychological pollution that makes them feel that farming is backward, primitive, and they're doing everything they can to borrow and even, just devote their whole lives now to helping their children get an education that will take them to the city. So we have forces now that are psychologically pressuring towards urbanization and the destruction of farming. The end goal of this algorithmic system, which is what it is now, come back to that, will be 100% urbanization and food production in the hands of robots. Robots linked to drones, linked to satellites to monitor carbon. We really urgently need to wake up to the fact that this system cannot work. It will not work. It's based on extracting minerals from every possible source. The rare earth minerals that are needed, and that now mean that we're locked into sort of warlike competition over these minerals in the deepest seabed and on Mars, and of course destroying the Congo, etc. The resources that go into this search for energy, even as part of the Green New Deal, where we're supposedly going to be able to fuel all this with renewable energy, but we're not. We are not going to be able to do that without being even more destructive than we have been in the era of oil. So I hope, what I'm saying for some people will be quite shocking. It will feel a bit overwhelming because we're talking about a big system for sure. But I so want you to take home this message that it pays off enormously to look at the big picture, because the big picture that organizations like ours are bringing is not only the evidence of the destructive nature and the absolutely dead end that's going to come if we continue in the same direction, but we are bringing information also about the very clear evidence that going a bit slower, going a bit smaller, going more local instead of global brings with it enormous benefits. Where you can see this most clearly is when you study food production. What you will see is that, first of all, as I said before, this system started by driving people off the land, and big traders were able, to benefit from slavery and enclosures. With the enclosures, people were being driven off the land into London, which was a complete mess, ill health, crime, breakdown, because there was this rapid exploitative pressure that destroyed people's land-based, smaller scale, human scale institutions, where they had developed ways of working with each other, interdependent with their communities, with their region, with the land. Now suddenly these enormous global forces were contributing to this breakdown of that local fabric. Now, we don't need to go all the way back to that because, well, I think it helps us to understand that this has been a continuum. And it may also help us to realize that the drivers of that change, those real trading barons, were overtly racist, overtly misogynist, overtly anti-nature. You can see it in their writings. So in a fundamental way, we are dealing with this patriarchal and very destructive system. However, we would argue that culturally, the majority of people have actually been turning away from those values. Particularly if we look at the cultural trajectory, we'll see that in the Victorian era, it may be that most people bought into these values in the West. You know, in Victorian England, people generally probably thought that other people were inferior and that it was okay that they should be slaughtered or even hunted like animals. But we can see this huge cultural progress where people have clearly changed away from this racism, away from the misogyny, and very clearly want to develop a better relationship with nature. Now, that cultural shift is what lies behind also the massive localization movement, which is coming up from the bottom up. I say massive because it is everywhere, and yet most of the initiatives are small and they're not so visible. But to come back to frame this, or rather to spell out how this is so important for anyone concerned with food and farming, we need to look at the fact that, again, from the very beginning, this involved pushing people towards monocultural production. So the slaves who were pushed away from producing a range of things for themselves were suddenly on cotton plantations, tea plantations, coffee plantations. And what we can see in the modern era is that this process was exacerbated and continued by the so-called cheap fossil fuels. So that in the industrialized world, particularly after the Second World War, hundreds of millions of farmers were destroyed by replacing them with technology. The technologies that were used were, of course, the machinery, but also the chemicals, the chemical fertilizers, the chemical pesticides, all coming from fossil fuels, all coming out of the war machinery. From the bottom up, we've had a people's movement rejecting this. We've had very strong pressure, which has led to government support for organics, which has led to corporate interest in organics. But unfortunately, the reality is that because, particularly as I said in the last 35 years, corporations already had so much power that they were able to wiggle their way out of actually responding to what people wanted. People wanted a better relationship with nature. They were demanding healthier organic food. And what happened is that well-intentioned, I knew many of them personally, including Morris Strong, who organized the big meeting in Rio in 1992, where basically the world's environmental movement gathered. And there, because corporate heads were involved in having funded the entire conference, the framing didn't look at the problems with giant corporations and with the way that they had been amassing their wealth through global trade and through an imposition of larger and larger monocultures destroying diversified production for local needs, for regional needs, for even national needs. Suddenly, well, I should say gradually, but very much, very clearly spelled out in the Rio meeting. And all of this had started by the mid-80s. There was no longer a demand, as there had been in the 70s and early 80s, for decentralization, for decentralized renewable energy. Now, what we were doing was looking at symptoms, starting to look at climate change, starting to talk about biodiversity, about forests, about water, about indigenous people, about women, but not about the system that was continuing to drive the world towards monoculture. Now, the monocultures can never ever produce as much as diversified farms and fields can. Now, you could take any two bits of land, and I can guarantee, whether it's a square meter or a square kilometer of land, diversity on one, monoculture on the other, you will always be able to produce much more with diversified production. Where we can see this very clearly is in the local food movement, where small farms closely linked to their market are able to diversify, in many cases to the point of 100 different species or more, including animals, very important in the cycle, to produce fertilizer that is then ends up being a carbon sink. It's the animal factories that are the most cruel, the most hideous, the most wasteful form of production. People farmed for thousands of years, actually tens of thousands of years, involving animals and animal products, and they did not create climate change. So you have this craziness right now that we're just talking about carbon. We're not talking about diversity. We're not talking about healthy water, healthy ecosystems, healthy people. And above all, we're not talking about how more localized systems, where we shorten the distance between production and consumption, how those systems can produce 10 times, even 100 times more food. And when you add biomass, you add fiber for clothing, you add building materials from wood, etc., you're getting, vastly more productive systems. The key thing that keeps us from implementing this on a much larger scale is that our economic system has ensured that we have heavy subsidies for energy and technology, and that human labor, by contrast, is far too expensive. The more diversified small farms require, and the beauty of it is that they do employ far more people. And in the new local food movements around the world, what we're seeing is this higher productivity, more jobs. We're seeing the reduction, of course, massive reduction in the transport, the emissions, the refrigeration, massive reduction in plastic. We're seeing the rebuilding of the community fabric. There are countless examples now around the world. This is particularly in the more industrialized parts of the world. But even in cities like Beijing, even in New Delhi, people are beginning to bring back that closer relationship between the consumer and the farmer. And they are demonstrating that, number one, we should be doing everything we can to protect those farmers who in the so-called South are producing 80% of the food. They need protection. We need to be aware that trade deregulation is the biggest threat to their well-being. We need to start lobbying for a very clear demand that we push the pause button on further bilateral or multilateral trade treaties. We need to be lobbying for new trade treaties that start shifting the power away from the global to support the local. We want to see a deregulation at the local level, and we want to see local communities, local governments involved both in the shaping and the implementation of those regulations, because local knowledge systems are vital for maintaining biodiversity. The death of knowledge systems, which is linked to the death of languages, the death of cultures, is one of the most frightening fatalities in this global system, promoting agricultural monoculture and human monoculture, consumer monoculture. So this is a very big picture, and I hope that people will look at more of our materials. We have a film called The Economics of Happiness that tries to spell out this bigger picture, because we call it the economics of happiness, because one of the most important ingredients in this transition back towards reconnecting with our farmers, reconnecting with nature, rebuilding community, is that it answers the deep human need for connection. We are witnessing epidemics of depression, anxiety, addiction. I hope some of you will have heard of Gabor Mate, who is one of the wise voices in raising awareness about the fact that this trauma and all of these addictions, anxiety, are linked to our disconnection, to our lack of feeling a sense of belonging to community, a sense of belonging to place, to the natural world. So this big picture offers enormous hope, because there are so many examples of that demonstrate what I'm saying. However, help us get this out. And if you haven't heard about this bigger picture, please inform yourself, spread the word. Right now, as Andre was saying, we're talking about the majority of farmers on this planet who are still producing the majority of food on this planet. So we mustn't fall into the trap of believing that all is lost, that life is going to end in another decade. No, there is a chance to turn things around. There is a chance to right now contribute in a way that will be truly meaningful. Often our ignorance about what's going on the other side of the world prevents us from seeing these opportunities. Our work started on the other side of the world, as Andre was saying, in Ladakh, where I had the amazing opportunity to live in an indigenous culture, speaking the language fluently before the advent of the modern world. So I had an incredible gift, also an incredible sort of responsibility, I have to say, because very few people have actually experienced a functioning, healthy, indigenous local culture. Even Christianity started a lot of the destruction, a very long time ago. And of course, the global economic system has been at it for hundreds of years. So I hope that you will look at our materials, read about Ladakh. Bhutan is also a place where we worked over several years. And this is a story of hope. Localization is the economics of happiness, it's the economics of health. Ecological well-being, human well-being are completely linked. And there is a way forward that we can start engaging with right now. Our latest tool that we can offer you is a localization guide that suggests actions that you can take immediately to help move the world in this direction. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Look, Helena, thank you so much. The fact is, you didn't need to have videos. You did a great job. And look, just quickly, we've got a few minutes. I'd like to just do one question before we go over to the next speakers. And this is from Matthew Magnuson, and I think it's actually a really important question that needs to be answered. And he says, same here in the US. We subsidize mega farms to the point that has destroyed local farmer. On the hopeful side, there are many large cities where smaller farms in the city are popping up. So would you like to just
Yeah,
put that?
I would actually, I would really like to comment on that because I want all of you to be very aware that there's huge propaganda for 100% urbanization. So there is a whole machine. It's a machine like algorithmic creation of a fake casino where literally fake money is being created. It's linked to Wall Street. I mean, Wall Street linked to Silicon Valley and probably to the Pentagon, to the war machine. And this, so we have to be careful when we say about farms in the city, because part of the sort of propaganda they're putting out is that there will be these farms in the city because we're going to have AI driven cars and there won't be any traffic somehow, I don't know. And it's all going to be walking distance. But it's a completely false reality, as I said, based on all that mining, based on total control, where we will have no power over our own lives, that will not enable us to rebuild those deep connections to nature and to have greater control over our lives and to allow diversity to flourish. So there are farms in the city, some of which are wonderful, but beware of the propaganda for urbanization. And most of the ones I know about are actually farms on the edge of cities that have linked up with the city center. And this is what cities need to do now. They need to start to rebuild those relationships. Because I didn't mention before, but we have this insanity where our food is coming from further and further away, and countries are routinely importing and exporting the same product. Milk in, milk out, beef in, beef out, and then food is being transported across the world to be processed as well. So shortening the links is happening, it's wonderful, and some in the city too are good.
Thank you so much, Helena. It's just wonderful. And I hope people actually enjoyed this segment. We're trying to present a global overview here of one of the most important issues and where we have to prioritize our systems. If we want to nourish this planet and have fairness, we need to localize. And that doesn't mean we don't have exports and all the other things to do with it, but it's getting the balance right. If we're going to feed people, nourish people, we put food on the table first and we work out from there. And as Helena said, small is the best.